So Tom is a catalyst cross-pollinator of ideas, vegan and ethically sourced. So,
how's the sound check? Got applause for a sound check. I just hope you like this song. People are hungry. They don't have enough money to buy food to eat. Farmers that grow the food are losing their farms because they can't get out of debt. Large agribusiness markets sell poisoned food from contaminated soil at an affordable price. People get sick from eating bad diet, from eating profit-driven crap. Will it be that eventually people won't be able to afford to eat unless if they work for those self-same corporations which supply the poisoned food while destroying the earth? People are hungry, they don't have enough money to buy food to eat. Farmers that grow the food are losing their farms because they can't get out of debt. Large agribusiness markets sell poison food from contaminated soil at an affordable price. People get sick from eating bad diet, from eating profit-driven crap. Will it be that eventually people won't be able to afford to eat unless if they work for those self-same corporations which supply the poisoned food while destroying the earth? That eventually people won't be able to afford to eat unless if they work for those self-same corporations which supply the poison food while destroying the earth. People are hungry, they don't have enough money to buy food to eat. Farmers that grow the food are losing their farms because they can't get out of debt.
Is capitalism versus life on Earth? Is the answer to free market, green capitalism, or mass anti-capitalist action? And our speakers are as follows, and they will go in the order that I introduced them. First, we have Brother Ian Angus. He's the co-author of the Second Eco-Socialist Manifesto. He's currently helping to organize a new global eco-socialist network. For 12 years, he has been editor of the online journal Climate and Capitalism. Some of his books, including Canadian Bolsheviks Facing the and A Redder Shade of Green, can be purchased at the back of the room. So books are at the back of the room. Our second speaker will be Sister Comrade Yvonne Anson. Anson is a committed advocate on the environmental and inequality. She worked with groups like Our Time, Force of Nature, and Extinction Extinction Rebellion to push Canada forward on the biggest issue of our time. Born in Vancouver and raised in Squamish, Yvonne moved back to Vancouver after high school to attend post-secondary and earn a degree in political science from Simon Fraser University. Yvonne was the NDP candidate in Vancouver-Granville and is a member of Socialist Action. And our third speaker is Comrade Gary Porter. He grew up in a union home, joined the CCF youth movement at 13 years of age. Wow. Met Ian Angus at Carleton University. Joined the Young Socialists in 1964, just after Ian. In 1967, he moved to Toronto and was elected executive secretary of the Young Socialist League. Okay, just a little French. Thank you very much. He held full-time staff positions in the YS and LSA for 7 years. An organizer of the Vancouver branch of the LSA-LSO, Central Organizational Secretary based in Toronto, and Metro Toronto organizer when there was 3 branches. Listen, I am bilingual, but unfortunately it's Newfoundlandese and English. Mostly Newfoundlandese. Okay, he has written major policy resolutions and many articles for the Socialist Press. Gary joined Socialist Action 2 years ago, and we're so glad he did, on Vancouver Island, will be part of a new SA branch in South BC shortly. He is a member of the SA, yes, you can applaud that, comrades. He is a member of the SA Central Committee. During his career as a licensed public accountant in Ontario, Gary served 8 years as a member of the board of directors of the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. He has been an auditor for many unions and is presently on the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee and on the executive as NDP District Association on Vancouver Island. So we've got a great panel, so sit back and relax and listen, and our first speaker is Ian.
Hi. What was missing in the introduction to Gary was that 50 years ago this past February, he was best man for Liz and me. This is at the back, so we just had our 50th anniversary.
Congratulations.
And Gary and I just had our 55th anniversary since we joined the movement. Okay, capitalism versus life on Earth. We're going to cover different aspects of it. I want to discuss that as a broader topic. And you know, it seems like every week I get a ton of stuff about the climate and about the environment, but almost every week there's a new major official report about the consequences of climate change. So I'd like to start off by quoting a few sentences from a report that was published in August, but it didn't get very much publicity. This is just a few sentences from that report. Sea level rise, changes in water and food security, and more frequent extreme weather events are likely to result in the migration of large segments of the population. Rising seas will displace tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, creating massive enduring instability. Saltwater intrusion into coastal areas and changing weather patterns will also compromise or eliminate fresh water supplies in many parts of the world. A warming trend will also increase the range of insects that are vectors for infectious tropical diseases. This, coupled with large-scale human migration from tropical nations, will increase the spread of infectious disease. The increased likelihood of more intense and longer duration drought in some areas, followed by greater atmospheric heating, will put an increased strain on the aging U.S. power grid and further spur large-scale human migration elsewhere. Power generation in the U.S. hydroelectric and nuclear facilities will be affected. Prudent risk management therefore suggests that we should work to avoid the catastrophic outcome and prepare for and mitigate climate change. Okay, now, you could easily find similar comments to that in many, many reports. In fact, I'm sure at least some of you, possibly all, have seen far scarier comments in reports and articles and talks about climate change. But what makes this one particularly of interest is that it was commissioned by the Pentagon. Specifically, by the general who is now the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You may know that when Trump came to office, he ordered all of the U.S. government departments to cease their projects about preparing for climate change. The military ignored him. The authors of this report are senior officials in the US Army, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and NASA, and it was published by the United States Army War College. The report recommends strengthening US military, which is already the biggest war machine on Earth, to protect the US military from the consequences of environmental chaos. We protect the US empire, rather. They call for, quote, a campaign plan-like approach to proactively prepare for likely conflict and mitigate the impacts. Now, as we all know, whenever the US military embarks on something they call a campaign, the result is always devastation and destruction for the poor and the oppressed. Today, when the US government is controlled by climate change deniers, and most other capitalist governments, including Canada, give lip service to science but refuse to take serious action. This report doesn't mention that fact, but it is clearly true that the US military, unlike the US president, is fully aware that climate change is real and they expect the consequences to be catastrophic. This military report shows, and by the way, you can find it on the internet, it's not secret. This military report shows, in a partial and self-serving way, that something has gone terribly wrong in the relationship between human society and the Earth. Climate change is only the most extreme crisis, a very serious one, but it's not the only one. What we face in the 21st century are multiple ecological crises that threaten the very survival of civilization. Earth system scientists a few years ago identified 9 of what they called planetary boundaries. These were global environmental conditions that for thousands of years, basically since the last ice age, 11,000 years ago, these planetary boundaries, they said, defined a safe operating space for humanity. These are the environmental conditions that have existed since before the invention of agriculture. So all human societies that we know of any size beyond hunter-gatherer groups, have lived in these conditions. And what they are now saying, these scientists, is that crossing any one of those 9 thresholds could have deleterious and even disastrous consequences for human well-being. 7 of the 9 critical planetary boundaries that they identified are close to or already in the danger zone. That research, and much like it, leads irresistibly to the conclusion that modest reforms and policy shifts are not going to be enough to prevent environmental catastrophe. Because what we face are not individual problems that can be tackled one at a time, but an interlocked set of disruptions of Earth's life support systems. Fundamental natural processes that have evolved over millions of years are being shattered in just a few decades. Radical remedies are obviously required, but we won't find a cure unless we identify the underlying cause, the systematic disease that is attacking our life support systems. Possibly the most common explanation that is offered by environmental writers is that the underlying problem is growth. The drive to produce ever more stuff is filling our rivers with pollution, our air with poison. The oceans are dying, species are disappearing at unprecedented rates, water is running short, soil is eroding much faster than it can be replaced, but the growth machine pushes on. Corporate executives, bureaucrats, pundits, and of course, economists and politicians all agree that growth is good and non-growth is bad. Unending material expansion is a deliberate policy promoted by the ideologues of every political stripe, from social democrats to ultra-conservatives. When the G20 met here in Toronto a few years ago, they unanimously agreed that their highest priority was, quote, to lay the foundation for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. They put out a final declaration. It was about 4-page long. The word growth appeared 29 times in that declaration. So why, you have to ask, in the face of massive evidence that constant expansion of production and extraction of resources is killing us, do governments and corporations keep shoveling coal for the runaway growth train? In most environmental writings, one of two explanations is offered. Either growth is a problem of human nature, or it's a mistake. The human nature argument is central to mainstream economics. Going back to Adam Smith, human beings always want more, and economic growth is just capitalism's way of meeting that fundamental human desire. For our species, enough is never enough. That view often leads its proponents to conclude that the only way to slow or reverse the pillaging of Mother Earth is to slow or reverse population growth. More people equals more stuff, so fewer people must equal less stuff. It's really as simplistic as that once you dig through the wordage. Now, the fact that the countries that have the highest birth rates generally have the lowest standard of living, and in fact have the lowest amount of stuff, also produce the least amount of pollution, fatally undermines that argument. As a study at Yale showed, if the poorest 3 billion people on the planet somehow disappeared tomorrow, there would be virtually no reduction in ongoing environmental destruction. The other common explanation for the constant promotion of growth is that we've been seduced by a false ideology. The people in charge have somehow bought in to a wrong set of ideas. The drive for growth has been variously described as a fetish, an obsession, an addiction, or even a spell. The term growth mania has shown it up several times lately. As Fawzi Abraham, who's a British Marxist, writes, such accounts present the drive for growth as, quote, a psychological obsession, a sort of collective whim that simultaneously grips all governments and all economists worldwide, some kind of elaborate global conspiracy. It goes on, you might as well describe fish as having a fetish for water, as capitalism having a fetish for growth. Growth is as essential to capitalism as water is to fish. Just as a fish will die without water, capitalism would drown without growth. Because as Marxists, we understand then that growth ideology doesn't cause perpetual accumulation. It justifies it. It's not a cause, it's an excuse. Uncontrolled growth is not the root cause of the global crisis. It is the inevitable result of the profit system, of capitalism's inherent drive to accumulate ever more capital. Now, if you were to ask them individually, you go up to the president of any big corporation and say, do you want your children and grandchildren to live in a clean, environmentally sustainable world? I'm willing to bet every one of them would say yes. And they wouldn't be being hypocritical. They really do think they want that. But that's them as grandparents. As major shareholders and executives in top corporations, they act, as in a wonderful phrase from Karl Marx, as personifications of capital. Regardless of how they live at home, how they behave at home, and with their children, at work, they are capital in human form. And the values and imperatives of capital take precedence over all other needs and values. So when it comes to choosing between protecting humanity's future and maximizing profit, they choose profit. Let's give you a case in point. We hear a lot about carbon dioxide and methane a lot. We don't hear quite so much about the nitrogen oxide gases, nitrogen monoxide and nitrogen dioxide. They are not only very powerful greenhouse gases, They are also directly harmful to human health. They can damage your respiratory tract, cause long-term chronic lung disease, and they increase the severity of asthma attacks and other diseases of the lungs and throat. They're a major cause of death. Nitrogen oxides are produced by burning petroleum, particularly by diesel engines. In 2009, regulators in Europe and North America introduced strict limits on automobile-produced nitrogen oxide. All automobiles had to submit their cars for testing to prove that their cars did not emit above fairly low levels. These are not bad regulations. Well, this was a big problem for the world's second largest automobile company, Volkswagen, because much of their profit came from vehicles with diesel engines that did not meet the regulations. But as we're often told, in capitalism, the pressures of competition, the need to make more money, produces innovation. So just in time, Volkswagen announced that its engineers had solved the problem. They had invented a new diesel technology that fully met or exceeded the new standards. They promoted it very heavily, beginning in 2009, under the slogan Clean Diesel, and it was hugely successful. Between 2009 and 2016, Volkswagen sold over 11 million clean diesel cars worldwide. Now that's pretty impressive. Here's a giant corporation doing well by doing good. They're making huge profits while protecting the environment and human health. Or so it seemed. Because in 2016, thanks to some rather dedicated engineers, we learned that clean diesel was a hoax. Volkswagen had not invented a new emissions technology. Volkswagen had invented software that cheated on the tests. When the software detected that a test was being run, because the tests are done under standard conditions, it reduced the engine's power and performance, which cut emissions to below the allowed level. Under laboratory conditions, Volkswagen's clean diesel cars met the regulations. On the road, they emitted up to 40 times more nitrogen oxide than the legal limit. Now, senior executives have been fired, and Volkswagen has paid heavy fines. But that's after the fact, after the damage was done by the decision in 2009 to use the cheat software. 7 years of Volkswagen pollution, 7 years of big Volkswagen profits and sales illustrates two fundamental characteristics of capitalism. Short-term gains are always more important than long-term losses. And maximizing profit is always more important than protecting human health. Volkswagen's owners and executives are personifications of capital. And capital has to grow no matter who gets hurt. Now the reason it has to grow is really simple. It doesn't take a lot of thinking to work this one out. But its implications are complex and profound. Capital has to grow because big banks and monetary funds and multimillionaires and others invest in corporations like Volkswagen in order to get more money back. They don't invest out of the good of their health because they like Volkswagen to have it for their money, or they don't want to lose their money. They want more. They don't care if Volkswagen makes cars or clothes or candy bars so long as they get a return on their investment. Corporations, whatever else we may say about them, corporations are giant social machines for turning capital into more capital. That's what shareholders expect and want, and that's what managers and executives must deliver. A person who is unwilling to put the needs of capital first is very unlikely to get into the executive suite. But if the screening process fails, a corporate executive suddenly has an inconvenient attack of conscience, he or she will not last long in that position. It's been called, I love the phrase, the ecological tyranny of the bottom line. When protecting humanity and the planet might reduce profits, corporations will always put profits first. Capital has only one measure of success. How much more profit was made in this quarter than last quarter? How much more today than yesterday? It doesn't matter if the sales include products that are themselves harmful to human beings and nature, or that can't be produced without spreading disease, or destroying forests, or demolishing ecosystems, or treating our water, air, and soil as sewers for the disposal of industrial waste.
3 minutes.
3 minutes left? I thought I had 40 minutes in total.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Ian. Yeah, I was just split differently on this panel.
I apologize,
Whoa.
comrade. Heart attack, City.
Okay, I get an extra 30 seconds. I watched you do that for Jeff before.
No,
Okay,
I'm sorry. You've
that's-
got more time than the
that's
other two
okay.
panels.
Okay,
Okay.
if it all contributes to the growth of capital, that's what counts. Capital has existed in various forms. You know, capital is not a brand new thing. It's existed in various forms for thousands of years. But only in the past few centuries has it defined and dominated the global economy. A small minority owns almost all of the profit-producing wealth and lives on the proceeds. And most people have to work for that minority in order to survive. Employees produce more wealth than they're paid, and capital grows by taking part or all of the surplus. As Karl Marx said, the historical mission of the bourgeoisie is accumulation for accumulation's sake, production for production's sake, production on a constantly increasing scale. Each corporation seeks to ensure that its products produce an attractive product on invested capital. A corporation that has lower costs or more attractive products can drive its competitors out of business. This creates irresistible pressure on all corporations to raise productivity and reduce costs, and otherwise make their products more saleable. And that pushes the system. But by the way, when they say increase productivity, they don't mean make it better. They mean make it more of it cheaper. And that pushes the system as a whole to expand physically, financially, and geographically. If nothing stops it, capital will try to expand infinitely. But the Earth isn't infinite. It's pretty big. The atmosphere and the oceans and the forests are big, but they're finite, limited resources, and capitalism is now pressing against those limits. Greenhouse gas emissions are not unusual or exceptional. Pouring crap into the environment is a fundamental feature of capitalism, and it isn't going to stop as long as capitalism survives. And that's why solutions like cap and trade have failed so badly, and will continue to fail. Waste and pollution are built into the system's DNA. Capitalism has to grow. A zero-growth capitalist economy simply can't exist. Now, that fact that capital needs to grow, of course, doesn't mean it always can. And on the contrary, the drive to grow periodically leads to a situation in which more commodities are produced than can be sold. The result, typically, is a crisis in which immense amounts of wealth are destroyed before growth begins again. Individual corporations can and do go out of business in such situations, but over the long term, the drive for profit to accumulate ever more capital always reasserts itself. That is the defining feature of the capitalist system and the root cause of the global environmental crisis. The results of that system, the anti-ecological results of that system, were first analyzed in the 1800s, looking at British agriculture. You know, it's the German scientist Justus von Liebig who showed that in its natural state, the soil provides the essential nutrients that allow plants to grow and replenishes the store of those ingredients from plants and animal waste. He used the word metabolism, which was then a brand new word. People hadn't used it before then much, for those interactions and chemical biological exchanges between humans and plants and animals and soil. And he said that traditionally, what was grown on farms was mostly eaten there or in the neighborhood. The result is that food waste and excrement went back to the land. But when farming was primarily geared to the market, as it was beginning sometime in the early 1800s, the crops were sold and consumed elsewhere. The soil fertility suffered because food waste and excrement did not return to the soil. In England, I wrote an article about this for Monthly Review a couple of years ago, thousands of tons, literally that's metric tons, of human waste were dumped into the Thames every year, destroying river fisheries and polluting the drinking water. One result was that between 1830 and 1865, tens of thousands of people in London died of cholera, which is a disease that's spread by water that's polluted with human waste. Liebig called this a robbery system because the nutrients were being stolen from the soil. Karl Marx seized on that work. He studied it intensely. He used the word metabolism repeatedly in his notebooks and in Capital to describe the biological and physical cycles that are essential to life, and he made it central to his analysis of the relationship between humanity and nature. He viewed the shift away from using human manure as an example of capitalist society's alienation from the natural world on which human life depends. In Capital, Marx integrated Liebig's explanation of the soil exhaustion crisis in British agriculture into his historical and social analysis of capitalism, showing how the imperatives of capitalist growth inevitably conflict with the laws of nature. He called this, quote, an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, a metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. The capitalists are agriculture, and remember, agriculture was the first major capitalist industry. And he said there's a rift now been created in the metabolism, the essential relationship between humanity and nature. And his analysis of that crisis was the theoretical starting point from what is now called metabolic rift theory, which is increasingly used by radical ecologists to describe ecological crises. The concept of metabolic rift expresses society's simultaneous dependence on and separation from the rest of nature. Capitalism is like an autoimmune disease that attacks the body it dwells in and depends on. It's both part of the natural world and at war with it. It simultaneously depends on and undermines Earth's life support system. Now here it gets worse. Because capital's destructive impulse don't just result from its need to grow, but from its need to grow faster. The circuit from investment to profit takes time. It requires time to complete. And the longer it takes, the less total return investors get. Other things being equal, an investment that returns the expected profit sooner will attract more capital than one that pays off later. If I get my money back more quickly, I can reinvest it more quickly. 2 circuits a year is great, 3 circuits is better than 2, and so on. Competition for investment produces constant pressure to speed up the cycle, to go from investment to production to sale ever more quickly. That's why in 1925, it took 16 weeks to raise a 2.5-pound chicken. Today, a chicken twice that big, 16 weeks, yes. Today, chickens twice that size are raised in 6 weeks.
Shame.
Selective breeding, hormones, and chemical feed have enabled factory farms to produce not just more meat, but more meat faster.
Disgusting.
The suffering of the animals, the quality of the food, those are secondary considerations, if they are considered at all. But most natural processes can't be speeded up as well as they've done with chickens. Nature's cycles operate at speeds that have evolved over millennia. Forcing them in any way inevitably destabilizes the cycle and produces very unpleasant results. Fertile land is destroyed, forests are clear-cut, fish populations collapse, all because capitalism needs to operate at speeds much faster than natural cycles of reproduction and growth. Take more fish out of the sea every year than are born. There's a result, a logical result to that. The Australian writers Christopher Wright and Daniel Nyberg have described this as processes of creative self-destruction. Our economic system, they wrote, is now engaged in ever more inventive ways to consume the very life support systems upon which we rely as a species. Moreover, this irrational activity is reinvented as perfectly normal and sensible process to which we all contribute and we all benefit. You know, liberal Greens sometimes suggest that we should eliminate quarterly reports, because then the capitalists wouldn't be under such pressure to produce something every 3 months. It's the report that's the problem, right? If we didn't know about it, we wouldn't do it. Such naive proposals confuse cause and effect, ignoring what Istvan Mazaros calls, quote, the incurably short-term horizon of the capitalist system. There is an insuperable conflict between nature's time and capital's time, between the cyclical Earth system processes that have developed over hundreds of millions of years and capital's need for rapid production, sale, and profit. The metabolic rifts that Liebig and Marx knew about and wrote were initially local or regional, but now they've gone global. Marx described this first in regard to Ireland, where there's a famine going on, was exporting food to England. England, he said, Marx wrote, has indirectly exported the soil of Ireland without allowing the cultivators the means to replace it. And Ireland was just the first victim of the global robbery system. Since the middle of the 20th century, capitalism has caused unprecedented changes in the entire biosphere, Earth's lands, forests, water, and air. In its endless search for profits, it is massively disrupting and destroying Earth's life support systems, the natural processes and cycles that have made life possible. Metabolic rifts have become metabolic chasms in our time. That's why the environmental crisis can't just be a talking point for eco-socialists, for socialists. We're in a planetary emergency that we have to treat as a top priority. We need to initiate and join struggles for immediate environmental aims. We need to participate not just as sideline critics, but as activists, builders, and leaders. At the same time, we need to find the best ways to patiently explain how those struggles relate to the larger fight to save the world from capitalist ecocide. As Simon Butler and I wrote in our book, Too Many People, in every country, we need governments that break out with the existing order, that are answerable only to working people, to farmers, the poor, indigenous communities, and immigrants. In a word, answerable to the victims of ecocidal capitalism, not of its victims and representatives. There's beneficiaries and representatives. Such governments will have two fundamental and inseparable characteristics. First, they will be committed to grassroots democracy, to radical egalitarianism, and to social justice. They will be based on collective ownership of the means of production, and they will work actively to eliminate exploitation, profit, and accumulation as the driving forces of our economy, to eliminate the causes of the problem. And second, they will base their decisions and actions on the best ecological principles, giving top priority to stopping anti-environmental practices, to restoring damaged ecosystems, and to re-establishing agriculture and industry on ecologically sound principles. Such a profound transformation will not just happen. In fact, it won't happen at all unless ecology has a central place in socialist theory, in the socialist program, and in the activity of the socialist movement. In brief, in the 21st century, socialists and Greens must be eco-socialists, and humanity needs an eco-socialist revolution. Thank you.
Thought I had 15, but okay. I can probably keep it to 10.
No, it's okay, because we've got extra time.
I'm giving this up all to this.
Okay?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here in Toronto. We're from BC, so I've been to Toronto once when I was 6, but never when I was old enough to remember or care that I was somewhere, so it's cool. Thank you, Ian. At the beginning, Ian talked a lot about some of the really devastating impacts of climate change that we're going to be witnessing over the next couple of decades. And on behalf of all of the young people in this room, can I just say, what a time to be alive. Like, wow. And like listening to it, I'm just like, it's hard for my eyes not to glaze over because we've already gone through these sort of periods of grief, and the 7 stages of grief end with acceptance. And that's a really, really terrible stage to have when it comes to something like the climate movement and like climate change. Because as soon as you accept that this is inevitable, and that yes, we're going to get sicker because ancient viruses are going to come out of the permafrost, and there's not going to be any clean water left, and agriculture is going to be completely impossible. Once you accept that, it does a lot to your psyche. And I think a lot of us have already gone through those stages and sort of, vicarious trauma is a good word for that. Sort of gone through those stages and processed it, and either become very angry and very mobilized and very motivated to get out there and do what we're doing today and do things like the climate march, or just completely shut down and become depressed and isolated, and capitalism really doesn't help with that. So we've had a question earlier today that was, where are the young people? What are they doing? This room is definitely predominantly people over 30, which there's nothing wrong with that. And there's a lot of young people in the climate activist movement. But where are the young people here today? A lot of them are working themselves to death under this hyper-capitalist, late-stage capitalist system. They're being kept in kind of conditions, working conditions where they are complicit in the system. They're forced to be complicit in the destruction of the planet in order to survive on the planet, which is really ironic and terrible to worry about both making rent at the end of the month and worrying about what the planet is going to look like at the end of the year. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Ian.
I don't apologize.
No. And one other thing that I just kind of wanted to talk about was what it's like being young in a climate crisis. What do you dream about? What do you aspire to? In ages past, you would dream about maybe owning a car, maybe having a single-family house, maybe starting a family. And, I don't dream about owning a car. Even an electric car, half of the emissions of an electric car are produced or come out of it in the production stage. So it's already kind of a bad thing to buy a new electric car. I don't dream of having a single family house. I think that's kind of an impossibility. I live in Vancouver, and you guys live in Toronto, so you feel it. And then I don't dream about having a family because, Lord, I don't want to raise more children on a planet that I grew up into, watching it die. I learned about honeybees at the same time as I learned about colony collapse disorder, and I learned about polar bears at the same time as I learned about melting ice sheets and starving polar bears. So I definitely don't want to raise kids under those same conditions because I know how angry and how horrible it makes you feel. So I'm going to read a little bit of a statement that I wrote that is kind of talking a bit about growth, and then gives some kind of analogies of what eco-socialism can be, what capitalism is, and then kind of talks about messaging and the role of messaging in the current climate crisis, in perpetuating that crisis, and how we can turn that messaging around and try and make something good out of it. We are living in a society that is constantly bombarded with messaging. And almost all of it is sponsored by the capitalist class. So what is our role as activists in turning that messaging around? And I made this into a PDF, so it's really, really small. So I'm going to pause a lot because I can't actually read it. So first off, I reject the myth of green capitalism and sustainable growth. I think everybody in this room probably does. I honestly don't believe that we can fight the failings of capitalism with more capitalism. I want to discuss the state of modern hyper-capitalism and the need to implement artificial limitations to keep economic growth in check. So first, I want to address a misconception, which Ian has already so nicely addressed. Capitalism is not just about profit, it's not just about private industry, it's about growth. And you cannot have infinite growth in a finite system. You simply can't. You need to have growing profits, otherwise the system begins to deform. Recessions happen and stalls happen, hyperinflations happen, and it collapses. And sometimes it collapses maybe into socialism, but usually it collapses into economic chaos that gets bailed out, and negative things tend to happen. So growth, endless, aimless economic expansion is necessary in order for capitalism to exist. and there is no such thing as sustainable growth. So Marx said that eventually the capitalists' drive to increase profits and suppress wages would get to a point where workers are no longer able to afford the products that they create. But we do have the global system of manufacturing, which has completely, capitalism at this point has completely grown around this model. And what it does is it means that, products are produced in countries where labor is very cheap, and then sold in countries where they can be sold at, very high prices. So it becomes profitable to load all of these products onto really big ships and cart them across the world where they can be sold. And the result of that is that 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from maritime shipping. 4%, that's huge, just from capitalists exploiting people around the world. And I mean, there's all sorts of other ways that happens with militarism, imperialism. All of those kind of infrastructural projects have massive greenhouse gas emissions. The military is one of the largest polluters in the world as well. But I'm not going to talk about that right now because that's a can of worms. So capitalist expansion has already grown beyond what should have been the natural economic limits that Marx predicted and that a few of us did. And now it's in the process of growing beyond the natural limits of the planet. And it can't do that because we only have one planet. Unfortunately, for the people who would like space mining to be the next thing, looking at you, Elon. Overfishing and clear-cut and chemical logging, fracking, factory farming, strip mining. These are processes that allow productive operations to continue growing and trading profitability, essentially, for environmental health. Basically selling our future for a short-term profit. Capitalists have gotten really good at gouging resources out of our rapidly declining ecosystem. And so economic limits are doing nothing to keep them in check. In the absence of effective limits, we need to place artificial limits on growth. We need to establish a system that is based on sustainability and stability instead of growth. The health of our planet absolutely depends on it. So I have a bit of an extended metaphor, and I recommend that you take this metaphor and you use it on people who really don't quite get it. Imagine taking a weed out of a garden and putting it in a pot. The weed will still grow to fill the pot, but it won't be able to take over the entire garden and disrupt the natural ecosystem around it. If the weed's constant growth is capitalist, then the pot is inherently anti-capitalist because it stops that growth. You can call it green capitalism, but that's not really what it is. If green capitalism is capitalism held tightly in check by a robust system of anti-capitalist policies, you can call it capitalism, but I would really rather call it democratic socialism because that's really what it is. Eco-socialism takes things one step further. We start by taking the weeds out of the garden and putting them into little pots, holding them tightly in check with strict regulations. And then we start to replace the potted weeds with more productive plants. We nationalize the infrastructure. For example, we start by forcing fossil fuel corporations to pay for the environmental damage they've caused through a system of fines. We add tight regulations to prevent further growth of that industry. Then we start to nationalize the industry and scale down their operations, gradually replacing those weeds with a more productive, clean energy sector. I'll take the metaphor a step further and say that if we take all of the weeds out of the ground and put them all into little pots and replace them all with more productive plants, there will be a lot more soil to grow things that actually benefit society, that actually help our garden. And by soil, of course, I mean wealth. By ensuring that our system can no longer concentrate vast amounts of wealth and power into the hands of a few particularly virile weeds, we can free up a lot of captive wealth that can be used to benefit average people and the environment. Policies like the wealth tax, carbon tax, and capital gains tax represent the very, very, very first steps on a very long staircase towards making these little pots happen. They're the raw clay that we can fire into these little pots. And okay, my last bit with this metaphor, I promise. I want to talk about permaculture. So I used to work at a garden store. I'm a big plant enthusiast. That's where this metaphor is coming from. But permaculture is essentially a self-sustaining garden system. So every plant in the garden has a purpose beyond just growth. There are plants that help to fertilize the soil, plants that help to store rainwater, plants that produce food and flowers for pollinators, and the animals that help transfer resources around the system. Everything in a permacultural farm is part of a cycle of processes that help to regenerate the system and keep it thriving. Everything has a purpose. No plant is there just to grow as big as possible. Every plant contributes in its own unique way, with value beyond just unchecked growth. This is a perfect metaphor for an eco-socialist society. This is the society that I want to live in. This is the society that we need to build if we want to prevent a handful of superweeds from completely ravaging the future of this planet. So what stands in the way? Well, the way I see it, and this is very speculative, but I see a lot of it comes down to trust and fear. And we know about social trust, we know about the need for trust. We need to trust that building an eco-socialist society is the right thing to do. And we need to trust that the planetary limits of growth are being reached and indeed surpassed, as the environmental scientists say they are. We need to trust that the roadmap that activists are laying out is the right one, and that it will still be effective, despite never having been walked before. Eco-socialism requires social trust. And trust-based systems naturally produce relative economic equality. If a trust-based system disproportionately advantaged a handful of individuals like capitalism does, the system would degrade and collapse because nobody would want to participate in it. Systems that are based on trust actually fundamentally undermine capitalist profitability. Worker co-ops, unions, cooperative housing, international regulations, climate action, all of these require that participants trust one another, and all will undermine the power and wealth of the capitalist class.
3 minutes.
Therefore, it's in the capitalists' best interests to undermine that trust. The best way to do that is by instilling and sponsoring fear. And so they invest in fear by sponsoring propaganda. In the case of climate action, the fear that is being propagandized is that the efforts that are necessary to act appropriately on climate represent some kind of new world order. That is a very powerful fear for a lot of people, believe it or not. Throw in the fear that scientists are being paid to lie to us, the fear that the cost of combating climate change will outweigh the benefits. And finally, there's the fear that even if our country dives in headfirst into climate action, it will have very little effect on the overall problem, and that the heaviest GHG emitting countries will fail to act and our radical efforts will be in vain. We hear this a lot when people blame countries like India and China in order to kind of wash their hands of responsibility. A huge portion of the emissions from India and China are produced in the manufacturing of goods that we consume frivolously here. We are responsible, we do have a role. The common thread that we see in these fear-based arguments against climate action isn't lack of knowledge. It is fear. Fear that that knowledge is incorrect. So fighting these arguments with stats and figures is just not effective. There's a fear that we will move forward with these under the assumption that climate action is the right thing to do, and we will wind up disproportionately benefiting someone else. I want to say that essentially this is the fear that a socialist-based, trust-based system will degrade and collapse into capitalist exploitation. Big oil, big agriculture, big business, they're all engaged in really sophisticated propaganda campaigns that play off and promote fears and misconceptions about climate action, because global efforts to combat climate change would hurt their profits. So we need to identify fear-based propaganda and counter it by sponsoring social trust. And I'm probably going to talk a little bit more about what that's going to take a little later, but essentially, we need to kind of promote a cultural shift. And like I said, facts and data are not going to be the best way to do that. We need to find messaging that is salient with the general public. And the propaganda campaigns that are being targeted at us are micro-targeted. They buy big data and they use that data to find arguments that are absolutely the most convincing. And the reason why fear is so convincing to some people, like it's been shown in many studies that people with right-wing beliefs just tend to have larger fear centers in their brain. Their amygdalas are slightly larger. You can look that up. It's real. I verified it. So in order to counter this fear, we need to promote trust. We need to abandon moralistic arguments. We need to abandon arguments that say, people are naturally evil, people are naturally out for themselves, and we need to counter that with messaging that says, look, people are inherently good, people inherently want to do things that benefit the society that they live in, because we all want to live in really positive, healthy societies. And we need to promote that with every ounce of our being in our daily lives constantly. Thank you.
Okay, Gary, Comrade Gary, 15 minutes.
My ophthalmologist says that I'm visually impaired, but I don't know what that means. What I can tell you is I can't see very well. So I have to hold my speech close. About 1 in 3 Canadians, by many estimates, and about the same number of Americans, by the way. For those of us in Canada who think that the Americans are all Neanderthals, it's not true. Just 1/3 of them. Anyway, 1 in 3 Americans do not agree that human activity is causing a life-threatening climate change, even though the science is absolutely established and the predicted effects are already happening. So I just wanted to say that before saying that in that regard, September 20th and September 27th were historic days. Something new has happened with those, and it's already slipping into the past, but I want to bring it back and put it right here in the room. Something new has happened. The world witnessed a massive outpouring of concern and anger about the accelerating global warming catastrophe. It's estimated that something close to 8 million people participated. Where do you think the largest demonstration in the world was?
Montreal.
Canada. Yeah, Montreal. The crisis already brings mass extinctions, desertification, floods, increasing numbers and intensity of storms, mass migration of humans to escape the worst effects, disappearance of freshwater, glaciers, and pollution of air, water, and the oceans. Initiated by high school students who have the most to lose, and joined by millions of other young and older people, the message to the world's leaders was, how dare you? How dare you ruin our world, our hopes, our futures, while all you think about is money, said Greta Thunberg. She spelled it out before the UN, the US Congress, and in mass demonstrations, and young people roared their approval. Politicians, by and large, got short shrift in these demonstrations, as young people spoke for themselves. The impulses of this new phase of the movement are very positive. It was organized to demonstrate the power of this movement in the streets and independent of the ruling class and ruling class politicians. It spoke independently and directly to the ruling class as the voice of a mass public street-based movement. It did not let them weasel out. I mean, Greta Thunberg and her supporters were speaking directly and not accepting any excuses. And it was very inclusive. It welcomed everyone and acknowledged the vital contribution of indigenous peoples. In its impulses, the movement is against the ruling class, the oil cartel, the capitalist government, who sometimes talk green but act for climate change, for supporting climate change. They talk green, but they subsidize the oil barons and the coal mine operators. Some, like Scheer and Trump and others, flatly deny the existence of climate change in the face of overwhelming evidence and increasing suffering. There were many signs against the oil companies in the demonstrations, the do-nothing policies, and about the system itself. What will happen as a result of these massive demonstrations? The oil barons are among the most powerful corporations in the world. They are completely integrated into the massive financial institutions, and they wield massive influence on capitalist states. What we call fossil capitalism means that the oil is part of it, it's integral. They wield massive influence on the capitalist state. The Pentagon protects them, and at the same time is the single biggest user of fossil fuels in the world by far. The Trump government, the most powerful in the world, opposes any concession to the opponents of climate catastrophe. In Canada, despite government lies and some real, mostly local efforts in the area of green energy production, oil and gas, carbon dioxide production actually increased 84% between 1990 and 2017. Transportation CO2 increased 43% in the same period because most vehicles still burn gas and diesel. The right-wing press and social media trolls have already begun their attack on the movement by trying to tie it to conspiracies and attacking Greta Thunberg personally. If the movement grows, this will get worse. Capitalist politicians will demand that parents and teachers and school boards punish kids who participate. Police will become more active, and so on. Even from the left-wingers who have bought into the conspiracy theories about Greta Thunberg, we know, of course, that she is surrounded by handlers, mostly liberals and social democrats, who believe that the system can be fixed. But so far, Greta and the millions of young people with her have not turned to electoral politics, but remained oriented towards the streets and mass action. Liberal capitalist politicians are looking desperately and anxiously for ways to divert this movement into electoral politics and capitalist parties, such as the Democratic Party in the United States, the Liberal Party of Canada, and the NDP. Parties that make insincere statements about fighting global warming, but vote for the oil cartels, massive subsidies and tax breaks, and buy oil pipelines out of workers' tax money. More subtle, the green capitalist politicians like Elizabeth May and Andrew Weaver, or social democrats like Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and the NDP leadership who advance Green New Deal proposals. These proposals are named after the New Deal advanced by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 to save capitalism during the Great Depression. He succeeded, and capitalism survived to bring us World War II, nuclear weapons, hunger and exploitation of the colonized Third World, endless wars against rebellious victims of imperialism, and now, the pièce de résistance, global warming. The Green New Deals do not threaten capitalism, which is the source of the problem. Upon critical analysis, they tend to be elitist, technocratic proposals with a veneer of democratic input by workers and indigenous peoples. In the end, the Elite Manifesto calls on politicians running for office in the capitalist parliament to take up the manifesto. It does not call for a mass independent movement. It does not call for nationalization of the integrated oil companies and banks under workers' control. It does not call for making polluters pay. It does not call for organizing green energy networks and publicly owned worker-managed networks. It merely advocates bourgeois electoral activity which will never solve this problem. The key problem is greenhouse gases produced primarily by the extraction, processing, distribution, and use of oil, gas, and coal. A massive capitalist enterprises that do this have known this for decades, that this causes global warming, and have hidden it, denied it, lied about it, and fought against it. Non-existent, also they talk about, how their efforts at green, which is complete nonsense. But they have become billionaires, and they intend to remain so. Supported by the capitalist governments and military forces. Profit is the sine qua non of capitalism. It comes before human need, even human survival, and the solution cannot be within capitalism. Arrayed against these powerful forces, however, is the very first positive beginnings of a mass movement on a global scale. To win, it will need to find its way through many traps, diversions, and attacks. Above all, it needs a clear direction and much more powerful forces. These forces are to be found in the unions and the working class as a whole. The working class in Canada is 18 million strong, 5 million of which are already in unions, a much higher percentage than in the United States, although I believe, and Jeff can correct me, the union movement in the United States has, for the first time in a very long time, taken a bit of an uptick in terms of membership. Some powerful unions have already spoken out against climate change. One of these is CUPE, Canada's biggest union with 600,000 members, who uses the slogan, "No jobs on a dead planet." The workers do everything and make everything and repair everything and transport everything. They know how to shut down oil wells and refineries, and they know best how to build green infrastructure. Without their support, we cannot defeat the capitalist polluters. The green plans talk about helping workers displaced by the change, but the workers will be the change. They'll carry out the change, or we will perish. So what should the movement do? Build the independent mass movement in the streets. Fight the capitalist politicians striving to drive it into electoral politics, although raise it in political campaigns, and certainly but just don't let it be directed there, where its power is in the streets, its power is in the workers, working class. Challenge all the politicians to support the goals and demands of the movement and denounce those who do not or who lie about it. Keep the movement open to all supporters and all their different ideas and views. Raise proposals to hold open democratic conferences and plan future actions and adopt key overall demands. Ask to speak. The students and the militants should be asking to speak to the union rank and file and urge them to send delegates to conferences, green conferences, and participate in actions. Suggest they put forward their own demands, the workers' demands. Advance demands that aim at the heart of the problem. Nationalize the oil, gas, and coal businesses and the banks who support them and are integrated with them under workers' control, not capitalist state control. No new oil and gas infrastructure. None. End all state tax breaks, subsidies, and loans for carbon fuel companies. No backstopping polluters like buying pipelines. Build worker-controlled green energy infrastructure. Build green, free, mass public transit. End all state financial support for industrial monoculture, chemical-use farming, mass boycott, divest, and sanctions campaigns against fossil fuel and its related products.
3 minutes.
Okay. Conclusion. I just got to that page. Conclusion. These are a few demands, examples more than anything, but they are key demands aimed at the biggest polluters and their state and financial supporters. They will help to expose the lies of capitalism. The fight for them is where we will learn confidence. And I suggest that confidence is another word that we should add to Yvonne's list of trust. And you gain confidence by fighting and winning, by retaining your independence, not being diverted by capitalist politicians. So we do need trust, and we need to build the trust, and people will trust the movement the more they participate in it and the more they win. So that's one of the best advertisements is get out in the streets and fight. Just like the women. Just like the women of Bolivia. They will help expose the lies of capitalism, the naked power of the massive polluting corporations, and they will win new supporters and help clarify who the real enemy is by fighting them. The answer is to defeat and the overturning of capitalism and the establishment of a workers' government to build a new carbon-free eco-socialist society. Human needs will come first in economic innovation for running the planet. An economic motivation for running the planet and for dividing us into oppressed groups will disappear. And I have this final thing that I wrote. Do I have any time?
Yes,
1 minute?
1.5.
Okay. It's important that revolutionary socialists keep a sharp eye on the development of the science and scientific information and the movements responding to it. The scope and depth of the climate threat is almost certain to generate sudden, massive, and sometimes new ways of working class and youth response. We have to realize this. This is a game for all the chips, eco-socialism. Let us respond as rapidly as we can, but also let us keep our minds open. Let's advance the democratic and transitional demands truly appropriate to the struggles at any given time, and argue for the independence, unity of purpose, non-exclusionism, and mass orientation of the struggle. Critical task of drawing the lessons, of pointing consistently to capitalism as the source of the problem, and of pointing the direction to socialism is our job. It can only be accomplished by the revolutionary socialists.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the floor. We're all very well trained now. This is the third session. We know what we have to do. So we're going to come back for 3 minutes each for intervention or questions, and the panel will take some notes so they can answer after we've had a few questions from the floor. Okay, so just a second. It's right here. Okay, so keep your hands up. Okay, so I got yours is up your list? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I got Mitchell, Steve, and okay, over here. Yes. Okay. So you got your hand up, brother, or are you just talking? You want on the list? Okay. Anybody else on this side that I missed your hands? Okay, Mitchell. Did somebody else have their hand up over there? Just one? Oh, okay. Mitchell. Yes.
Thank you for that great discussion today. Ian, I want to thank you for this terrific article you wrote in Monthly Review about superbugs. I found it extremely interesting and very scary. And today during your discussion, you touched on natural cycles of growth and how people are playing with hormones and bioengineering, especially as it relates to the fattening of chickens. But these days I've been reading a lot about and watching some documentaries on bioengineering, biohacking, and for lack of a better expression, I guess, do-it-yourself biology, where people play with this Crispr gene to cut into their own DNA. But I've been looking for a socialist perspective on this, and I haven't been able to find one. So my question is, what would a socialist perspective on this look like?
Okay, right there in the green shirt, Steve.
Yes, so what does the next economy look like? Because I think we're starting to get to a point where capitalism has developed to a point where it has like one way of doing things, and it's been driven by the price system and all of its conditions, and it has a mode of production. And inherently right in that mode of production, you can see all of the dysfunction that creates the environmental crisis. Not just the environmental crisis, but the economic one and the social one. And in that mode of production, capitalism is driven through centralized mass production of new things. It absolutely does not like to fix things. And that's really easy to find out why, because maintenance is very labor intensive. And capital hates labor. Why do you think every major subway system on the planet in big cities is rotting? It's freaking going into chaos. Because it hates labor. It can't do maintenance. One of the biggest factors that affect capitalism needs scarcity. Because without scarcity, there's no markets. There's no price system. And one of the ways it creates scarcity is through intellectual property. We have this, we know how to make this thing, and nobody else is going to find out. So that hugely affects the capability of having really local production for use, which is, I think, key to the next economy. We want to produce things locally for use, satisfy local needs, instead of having to make it in China and put it on a boat or a SpaceX thing or however they're going to fly it to North America. This is hugely bad for the environment. It's a wasted energy. The price system itself is incapable of measuring technical things. It doesn't measure energy. It doesn't measure mass. It has this completely arbitrary token that at one time had some roots in real measurement, but today it's just an arbitrary token that the banks manipulate to preserve the dictatorship that we enjoy.
30 seconds.
And that's all I'm going to say, thanks. Maybe somebody could comment on some of the things?
Okay, Daniel?
Hi everybody, I'm Daniel, new member of Socialist Action, PhD student in biochemistry, and environmentalism is what brought me to socialism. So I think this is really one of the things that's going to lead to an upswell in youth involvement, because again, it's our futures at stake. I really commiserate with you, Yvonne, when you talk about this dark humor and this kind of acceptance that people find themselves sucked into. A joke amongst my group of friends is my retirement plan is catastrophic climate change. Why should I save for a future that doesn't exist?
Buddy, we have the same joke. Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's just spontaneously spread across the whole world. It's everywhere. I want to share a few anecdotes. I work in the Mars building, College University. It's filled with startups and capitalist companies. They had a conference recently on environmentalism with the slogan where profit meets purpose. And that kind of shows you how capitalism is constrained in only one way of thinking. That has no way forward, because once you get these monopolies, once you get all these things going, they don't innovate, they can't. You talked about superbugs. No one's developing antibiotics anymore because it's not profitable. It's scary and it's already killing almost 1 million people a year, and that's going to become 10 million people very shortly. Every year, and no one's developing anything. That's a bit off track now. So I want to talk a little bit about Extinction Rebellion, because that's how I got involved, and you were involved. I really like them. They have this no shame, no blame policy. They're against neoliberalism to its core. It's not about modifying consumer habits, and that's really important. That's something that I think the animal liberation movement is still lacking. That one's too still focused on personal choices at the supermarket. And can you just comment then on Extinction Rebellion then, moving forward, because they're decidedly apolitical. And I do appreciate the comment about electoral politics and how that's maybe not the way forward, but they're also apolitical when it comes to any sort of, I guess, ideology. Although many people in Extinction Rebellion are socialists, they are not explicitly socialist. And I think that's really something that, going forward, you can't avoid it. You can talk around socialism, and every time we go to a traffic blockade, there's someone there talking about how capitalism sucks and how extraction is destroying the planet, but they can't bring themselves to say socialism because they're afraid of alienating people. And that's some trust that we need to build, I think. And thank you so much for your talks. That was really wonderful.
Thank you. Okay, here, Tom?
We have 3 more speakers, 2 more after Tom, and then we're coming back to the panel, and I still have other people on the list.
Thank you, panel. Thank you. I got a few notes there, and I'll reconfigure them when I get back. I've heard that CEO of MacBlow, a logging company out west, said that trees have no value until they're cut down. And that shows clearly differences in value. I also heard it said that competition is ungrounded male energy. What about cooperation? You know, I mean, that would be an idea, so that we leave the trees alive, we cooperate. That instead of having capitalism as this debt, a bank creates this money, and then, you know, I mean, the billionaires that have all these billions, they didn't get that from working. They get that from borrowing money that's created out of thin air from banks, and then throwing it into the system and getting dividends, and then, so anyways, and while people that are working at shitty jobs they hate, using resources to throw crap into landfills so they get a paycheck so they don't get evicted and they can keep their homes. How do we deal with that aspect of fear on a practical level to alleviate that so that people don't think, oh, just another political maniac that just has no solutions. Practical, community-based, cooperative. And also another issue that I think is really important is that, and you see that in Brexit or whatever, people want to have, or people want to have the say over what happens in their neighborhood. Not somebody 3,000 miles away decides that they're going to throw a chemical plant across from your school where your kids go, but that people actually have a say in what will actually happen for them, and that is what true democracy is, so that we can, on a grassroots level, be able to, in a sustainable way, house, clothe, and feed one another without destroying the planet. That's possible.
30 seconds.
And the alternative sucks.
Okay, the brother at the back with the cap in the back row.
And then Julius, and then we're coming back to the
Can you
panel.
put me in the list?
Hi. So in recent years, we've seen environmentalism, by some groups at least, be co-opted to promote imperialism, austerity. Recently, before the Bolivia coup kicked off, you saw a hashtag going around Twitter, SOS Bolivia, and it was no coincidence that this was sponsored, promoted by the National Endowment for Democracy. I was wondering what exactly we can do to distance these like imperialist wreckers, I don't know what else you would call them. These people clearly don't have any real interest in environmental preservation. How can we distance them from the mainstream environmental movement that isn't as politically conscious as the people in this room, who aren't as class conscious? Thanks.
Okay, so Julius.
Thank you. Again, great presentations. I work for the Ministry of Environment. I've worked there for about 12 years. It's not my fault that this is happening. I'm doing my best with the tools that I have, which is not very many, because of course my work is not a democratic space and the workers who are there have absolutely no say. And, sorry?
What are you doing for the ocean?
There are, well, besides the Arctic Ocean, there are no oceans in Ontario, and I work for the provincial government. Out of my jurisdiction, sorry. I wanted to say that it's, the Ministry of Environment, essentially what a lot of government workers do is we, like my job is we issue licenses to companies that pollute. And the idea is that, we try to mitigate the amount of pollutants that go into the atmosphere, and there is some effect. But there's always a consistent effort to try to accommodate industry all the time. It really is all about business development. It's about self-regulation and creating opportunities for businesses to expand and grow. I want to talk about the labor movement because I can't help it. I'm vice president of my local, and it's my sort of terrain within socialist action. In Montreal, they had 500,000 people show up for their one-day strike. 7,000 workers went on strike in that city. They left their job, they went on strike. It was an actual partial strike in that city. And it happened, I don't want to take anyone's thunder here who's from Montreal, but it happened because the labor movement organized around it. And they encouraged workers to go on strike. In Ontario, they didn't do that. They organized a leafleting at subway stations in Toronto saying, let's support the kids. Let's support the kids. Don't give the kids a hard time if they don't go to school that day. And I thought about Greta and her speech at the UN when she basically said, fuck all of you. I shouldn't be here, I should be in school right now. Who the fuck are you to clap and cheer me on? I don't want to be here. And I said this and I reminded folks, because they actually played that clip at the Toronto and York Regional Labour Council, and I was laughing to myself, howling to myself. And I got up to the stand and I said, this is actually about you folks in this room too. The misleaders of our labor movement, who have done nothing to mobilize and organize workers, even encouraging them to say, you know what, maybe today's the day. I mean, there's a lot of argument to say, well, where are workers at? Are workers ready for a general strike tomorrow? No. But the leadership won't even talk about it. They won't even present it as a possible idea to challenge the status quo. And that is unforgivable. It is absolutely unforgivable. So that's the type of thing that needs to happen in the workers' movement. That's what we're doing. There are no jobs on a dead planet. I'll have to say that it was fun to hand out the leaflets to people at the subway, and the ones who ignored you say, hey, there's no jobs on a dead planet. I know you're rushing to work, but just so you know. And we got a lot of people stopped, and we're like, oh shit, yeah, okay, that's true. Anyway, that's it.
Okay, thanks, Julius. Okay, we're coming back to the panel. For this round, we're going to get 5 minutes each. And we're going to start with Yvonne, then Gary, then Ian. Well, you can bring the mic over there. Ian?
Oh, you got it.
Okay.
Thanks very much. So I guess the first question was the socialist perspective on gene editing and CRISPR. And, I don't have the socialist perspective for that, but I would definitely say that we want to avoid slippery slope arguments when we're kind of examining it, because yes, there's a lot of really terrible places where that could go, but there's also a lot of good that could potentially come from it. We've seen good come from the splicing of vitamin A with rice to make golden rice that has cured certain deficiencies that cause blindness in parts of the world where nutrition is difficult to come by. So, there's great things that can be done. It's similar to automation in my view, where, if we do it appropriately and we do it within a socialist society, it could be great. But if we do it in a capitalist society, it probably won't be. Because nothing is. The next question was about local production and shifting towards local models of production. I absolutely agree we need smaller scale facilities, but we also need to make sure that when that production is happening, that it's done in environmentally friendly ways. Because within the current system, if you have systems of local production, say you're growing 100 carrots as opposed to 1,000 carrots, it's actually more environmentally efficient to grow 1,000 carrots and then transport them to a supermarket, 100 miles away, than it is to grow 100 carrots in that spot where you would sell them, which is really unfortunate, and I don't have the solution to that problem, but it's definitely something to look out for when we're talking about movements like the Buy Local movement, which has great intentions but could have really unfortunate consequences. The third question was about Extinction Rebellion. And yeah, I love Extinction Rebellion, but I totally agree, the same problem. It's extremely apolitical, and there's a lot of Greens, there's a lot of green capitalists, there's a lot of people who just have never really thought about politics, and this is actually something that I'm on the next panel, I think, and I'm going to be talking about kind of the problems within the climate movement, the problems within the socialist movement, and how they can be of mutual benefit to each other in fixing those respective problems. So yeah, stay tuned for that one. How to deal with the issue of fear on a practical level. I don't have great answers for that, but I would say, first off, lead by example. Participate in co-ops, participate in unions, participate in housing co-ops, especially young people who are just kind of starting out and looking for a direction to go in your life. If you can pick the most socialist direction you can pick, you should pick it, because that is what leading by example is. Also, volunteering on political campaigns is huge. Your voice, if you have an active role in a political campaign, your voice can go somewhere, and the voices of the people who you associate with and you organize with, those can go somewhere. And donate. Please donate to the causes that you can get behind, even just $5. Those are huge practical ways to counter that fear-based propaganda and show that, look, social action, when we all come together and do something together, it can work, and it can work really effectively and be really fun to participate in. And the last question that I wrote down was how to distance imperialist environmentalists from the movement. And I think a huge part of that is making way more space for more diverse voices within the movement. One thing that I have definitely heard criticisms of the environmental movement for is the lack of diversity. It's a very white movement. And having, an overwhelming abundance of white voices in one movement does lead to a lot of imperialism just based on historical precedents. And so if we want to kind of move past that, we really just need to step back and step up and do better. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Gary, 5 minutes?
There is a part of the movement that is definitely white, but I think we should notice that the people who have really been fighting for a very long time for ecological sanity are indigenous people all over the world. And the indigenous people are the majority of Bolivia, and it's the Evo Morales. Thank you. Evo Morales is indigenous. I mean, he's an indigenous, elected indigenous leader. And it's the opponents are white racists. But, there is maybe they're not talking together, but there's certainly a lot of participation. In fact, leading participation, often all by themselves. The indigenous people have been fighting against pollution and global warming. The area of genetics and genetic engineering and all that sort of thing, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it. I do come from an area where Macintosh apples were invented, and and that was by splicing.
Literally.
Yeah, yeah. And not splicing genes, splicing trees.
Grafting.
Yeah. So, they're still my favorite apple. I grew up very near where Macintosh actually started this type of apple. So there are ways of doing it. Motivation is a very important thing here. Why is it being done? If it's being done for profit, it will be done carelessly, it will be done based on how do we maximize profit. If we're trying to solve a problem based on human need so that we can make people healthier and so on, then it seems to me that there may be some prospect. And I really leave this up. I think probably Ian knows a lot more about this. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
I was afraid of that. A couple things to start off with. How can we distance ourselves from the imperialist takeovers? How can we avoid being co-opted, movements being co-opted? And let me tell you, the main answer is we can't. The fact is that the ruling class and capitalist powers are going to do their damnedest to co-opt anything that we do, any slogan. They will do their best. How do we counter it? Well, I'll tell you how we don't counter it. We don't counter it by standing aside, by sitting, as too much on the left does. And I hear this about XR a lot. I can't possibly go out and support XR because they support a very weird theory about social change, which they do. Some of the leaders do. But there's tens of thousands of people on those demonstrations, and most of them have never read that stupid stuff. They just know they want the climate change, and we got to be there talking to them. We cannot, there is I wish I had the book here, because in one of Lenin's articles about the Irish Rebellion in 1916, the Irish Rebellion was widely criticized by the social democratic left and even the Marxist left because they were Catholics, there were all kinds of... And Lenin says something to the effect of anybody who imagines that you can have a revolution without prejudices, without bourgeois errors, without the petty bourgeois having all of its foolish ideas involved, such a person is never going to make a revolution, because revolutions involve a lot of weird stuff. And that's not Lenin's words, that's mine. But my point is that this is not going to... one of the difficulties, to be honest, about socialists, about literally organized socialists, is all of us came to socialism intellectually. We are people who read books, listened to arguments, read leaflets, and so on. And that's important. It's important that people do that. But one of Marx's most important insights, I think his single most important insight, is that people do not change themselves and then change the world. In the mass, people change the world and change themselves in the process. And those are simultaneous processes, they're not one after the other. And we've got to bear that in mind, that the struggle, as Rosa Luxemburg says, revolutions aren't won by pamphlets, revolutions are won by struggle. And I think that's an extremely important concept. Now, on CRISPR and so on, we could have a very long discussion, by the way, about rice and vitamin A, because personally, I think it's a hoax. But I won't go into that. The main point I would make, I think Gary is right. The question is, what are they doing this kind of thing for? One thing you can guarantee is if something comes along that could make a profit, a capitalist somewhere will figure out how to make a profit from it. And I think the simple, my favorite example, the best, one of the most pure capitalists in the world are the Mexican drug cartels. They believe in competition, they believe in free enterprise, they believe in selling products to customers, they believe in locking customers in as best they can, and so on. They do it best. Now, they're not...
a psych system.
Many of the, on the whole, the capitalist class isn't thrilled with them because they cause certain kinds of disruption to the capitalist system, but they are doing what capitalists do. That is, there is an area where you can make a tremendous profit, and they're doing that. And the cigarette industry, who's the legal equivalent of the Mexican cartels, are doing exactly the same thing. And more people are dying now from cigarettes than died in the previous century, even though cigarette smoking has gone down in North America. It's gone way up all over the world because they figured out they could sell them easier there. So on CRISPR and on bioengineering, and this is also related, I would say, to climate engineering, and the whole thing is, on the whole, I don't know, and we don't know, Are we going to reach a point in a socialist society where we conclude we've got to do something major to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere? Or as Engels says, are we going to come to the point where we really think the population should be lower than it is, that it's gotten out of hand, and now we can tell without the interference of capitalism? He said, we'll figure out how to do it. But there's a subtext. We can't trust the bastards who are in power now with that kind of thing. Whoa. Period. And so restrictions, I think restrictions on CRISPR are important, because if it's used, it will be used for capitalist purposes in a capitalist society. And that's will be the dominant way it will be used. And I think that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be science, and there shouldn't be scientists working on it and figuring out what's possible, but it should be kept out of the hands of the profit mongers.
Woo! Thank you. Back to our list. Okay, so I have 3 speakers. Yes, I have you down. I have 3 speakers. I've got room for maybe 1 or 2 more, but no, you've already spoken. We'll see. We'll see if there's nobody else. Yes, I have you, BJ. Yes, you did, sister. You added up, and I put you down. Anyway, we won't argue. You're on the list. So, anybody else besides Daniel?
Am I there? Am I there?
No.
I'm in the list?
No, I didn't see your end.
Oh, can you put me, please?
No. Yes. Of course you is. Okay, so I have 1. Anybody else before I close the list? Seeing none, Daniel, you're lucky you get to speak second time, but not right now. Okay, so the list is now closed, and we will go to our speakers. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, including Daniel, and then we'll come back to the panel to wrap up. So BJ, you're up.
Okay.
Where do I start? First of all, I went to a seminar on UT campus sponsored by Science for Peace people last year in May. And it was called How to Save the World in a Hurry. And they felt that the 6 points were nuclear, climate change, cybersecurity, and food security, including the water resources. Now in Guelph, we're fighting a big battle against Nestle with regard to water resources. I wanted to mention too that University of Guelph was sponsoring a series of lectures on Wednesday mornings on various topics called Third Age Learning. And one of them was climate change, and they came to a consensus that capitalism was responsible. But Naomi Klein, of course, in her book says, her previous book said, no is not enough. So this is where we have to build for socialist democracy so the technology is in the right hands, as Ian says.
Okay, thank you, BJ. Okay, go ahead, you're up.
Yes, I have a general question to the panel or anybody else in the room who's got some information on it. I'm really interested in figuring out how to monitor the responses of insurance companies to all of this. There are parts of California now where I'm told that you can't get insurance. They're talking about really high levels of insurance to cover people that are living and building on floodplains in Canada. And there's many other areas where insurance companies are directly involved in the capitalist system. It's one way of using the capitalist system to bolster our arguments, especially in relation to climate change deniers. So that's the outline of what I'm curious about. If anybody in the room has got any information on how to evaluate the position of insurance companies, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, if the panel don't answer, you can talk after the session is over to the other people in the room, Cameron. Okay, you ready to see?
Hi, so my question for you, especially for you, Yvonne, not that, you guys too, because I am interested in what you have to say.
We're not offended.
No, Yvonne, because she's a very young person. I want to know what's your take on veganism? How can you be an environmentalist without being a vegan? all of you, I'm interested in what all of you have to say about that. Also, you, Danielle, said something about the animal rights movement that is still very based in individual choices. I am a vegan, and I would like to see more people, more socialists. I'd like to see socialists taking over the animal rights movement, really, because I see there are all kinds of vegans, like in any other, like if you're in the gay movement or in the women's movement, you have all the spectrum from right to left. You have everything there. The same with vegans. You said something. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Ian. You, Ian, said something very interesting about birth. I see many vegans viciously accusing people of having babies and saying, stop having babies because you are destroying the world. And you just said something that was like, washed my soul. You said, people that more have babies, people in poor places, they're not doing anything to the environment. We here are doing it. So I just brought these things up. I'd like to hear your opinion on veganism, on socialists taking over animal rights, how to be an environmentalist and not being a vegan.
Okay. Tom.
Yeah, I'm a veterinarian, very involved working with poultry farmers, and there's just a couple of points that came up I'd like to challenge, I guess. First of all, we have to we are living in Canada, we're living in Ontario, and there are some national differences that need to be you need to be careful with on data. It was interesting when Ian mentioned that, the stats around 16 weeks to raise a chicken back when, and now it's 6 weeks, twice the size. I'm thinking, yeah, and is that bad? I mean, in terms of affordable protein for the world, especially developing countries, poultry production, egg production, extremely important. And to me, what we're talking about is a reduction of the carbon footprint of agriculture, in particular in this case, the poultry production. Over the last 50 years, what we're talking about here is fewer inputs, fewer resources, get more protein with fewer inputs. So water consumption is down. I have the numbers on this, but I probably can't see it right now. Greenhouse gas emissions down 35% in the last 50 years. 75% fewer resources being used in poultry production. So in the same stats apply to the dairy industry, by the way. But eggs, in the egg industry, they produce 50% more eggs than 50 years ago with half the resources. So this means there's less negative impact on the environment, more affordable, high-quality protein for people. So I think we have to be very careful about this. I'm sure there's better ways of feeding the world and so on, and in a socialist system, there won't be the profit drive, but it's interesting to note that in Canada, poultry and dairy production is very much controlled by the farmers still. So there's no vertical integration, basically, that we see in the United States. Farmers own their own land, they own their own birds, and they also, through supply management, which all the politicians give lip service to, except for Bernier, but most of them don't know what it is. But basically, the poultry and dairy farmers in Canada have legislative authority to control how much is produced, to balance the production with the demand, so you don't have surplus. They're guaranteed a right to
30 seconds.
To be paid for their birds at the cost of production, and the ability to limit imports. So if you want to talk about eating local, well, certainly in the case of poultry and dairy, you can be assured with 80% certainty at least, because there are some imports allowed under the free trade agreements, but you're likely consuming food that was produced here in Ontario by Ontario farmers. We can't say the same thing for the greenhouse industry or the veggies that are imported and so on, but at least in that area. In just in terms, finally, on the greenhouse gas emissions, well, once again, I'll be really careful. Some numbers get thrown around. The figures that used to be out there was 18% of greenhouse gas emissions was due to agriculture. It's actually significantly less than that. It's 9%, and only 4% of that, only 4% is related to livestock, and only 0.08% is related to poultry. So compared to transportation, which I think is 27%, and energy, which is 31%, let's not beat up the farmers on this.
Okay, thanks, Comrade. Okay, Daniel, you have the last speaker.
Cool. So, as a socialist conference, we're talking about Crispr way more than I thought we'd be talking about. So I just wanted to clarify a few things so everybody's on the same page. This is not different in kind from genetic modified organisms, it's just different in degree. It's a new tool for modifying living organisms to maybe make them better, or in most cases, to make them patentable. That's the biggest thing when it comes to genetically modified organisms, and before that, hybrid crops. So again, capitalists, if they can make money, they will, and these technologies are ways of patenting things that we've long recognized as not being patentable. You can't patent a plant you found in the ground, you can't patent solar energy, you can't patent sun, I guess. But you can patent the techniques to produce these things, and that's how you can get a lot of control. So that's why, again, CRISPR can be an amazing technique to produce in a democratic way types of things that we need. And again, I think that's something you're talking about. The process isn't necessarily evil, technology isn't necessarily evil, it's who's controlling it and for whose benefit. So that's point one. Point two, we need to battle this misconception that socialism is the antithesis of technology. A lot of people think socialism is going backwards, it's regressive, that it's going to be like everybody living in rural communities. No, all the technology is there. We don't need to give it up. We worked for this. People discovered things. That's what's great about us. We're creative and we're intellectual and we're curious. And so we should keep the things that we develop, but we should yield the full benefits of what we developed. So that is the last point I want to end on. And really just, we got to win over the scientists to this, because they should be on the ground marching for this. Because I'm sick and tired of being a scientist and knowing that anything I discover, anything I develop, is going to be sold to a company for profit or buried so that it doesn't go into competition with their stuff. That's just sick. Thank you.
Well said, Comrade, well said. Okay, so we're going to come back to the panel for the wrap up. This time they each get 5 minutes. We're going to start with Ian, then Yvonne, and then Gary.
I'm going to need about 75 minutes.
Come back tomorrow.
Next week.
Yeah, okay, there was an awful lot of things raised. We could go into a very, very long discussion about industrial agriculture and its impacts on various forms and the difference between Canadian law and American law. And typically the huge problem with the endless debate over the greenhouse gases that come from agriculture, what do you include and what do you not include? Because if you look at the various, I read articles, I read a lot of stuff on this, and the fact is that generally speaking, all the various estimates I've seen total about 250% of the greenhouse gas emissions, because so much is counted twice and 3 times or not at all. When you're dealing with chickens, are you including the emissions that result from the fact that nitrogen in the fertilizer that grows the corn is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions, and more than half of them are corn that's grown in the United States ends up not as food but as feed. And those are questions that just make this, you can't argue it on simple statistics. It takes a lot of analysis. So I'd be glad to have a discussion at some point of this, and thank you for the input. These are not simple questions. They really aren't simple questions. Daniel, I agree entirely about getting scientists involved. If you're not already a member of Science for the People, you should be. And
we'll do that.
And we really need a branch of Science for the People here in Canada. There's no branch here yet. There's some individual members, and I've been involved. But there's some terrific people doing work in Science for the People in the United States. It's just an organization that was really big in the 70s and 80s and then died because they ran out of money and they got sued and stuff. But it's been reborn. They've got their magazines coming out again, and it's terrific. So let's help build that. That's an organization I would build. How do you monitor? The question of insurance companies is a good one. A question I keep running into when I run into fans of nuclear, and I know some really good left-wing fans of nuclear who can make the argument at great length, and they're good at it. And their argument, one of the consistent arguments, is that nuclear is way safer than we think. They keep telling me that because they're okay. You keep talking about Chernobyl and stuff, but it's rare, and there's hardly ever any accidents. And my response is pretty consistently that why won't insurance companies insure nuclear plants? Because if insurance companies were sure they could take big premiums and never have to pay, they would jump at the opportunity. But the main reason you can't get new nuclear plants built these days is because they can't get insurance. So, I think there's some important questions there. I think the insurance companies are people who spend a lot of time thinking about risk, and that's a good source of information about where the risks lie. Let me just say finally, on an entirely self-serving basis, Liz and I carried 2 heavy boxes of books here, and I'd like them to be way lighter when we leave. So please see me at the back of the room later.
Gary.
Nice try. Yeah, nice try.
Sorry. I don't know much of an answer to the insurance company question. My kind of thought would be you would honestly have to know an insurance broker or some people who are inside because otherwise that information is not going to be made public. The question about veganism is super interesting, and I'm really thankful for that question. My current strategy is to reduce and cut out the most harmful meats. So right now that's fish and red meat. Those are the most environmentally costly to produce. There is no such thing as sustainable seafood. There is no such thing. I'm sorry. It's either farmed, which is terrible for the environment, or it's taken out of the ocean, and all of the other animals in the ocean that rely on those fish stocks will starve. There's no way. You cannot do it. Fish was one of the first ones that I cut out, and then beef and lamb and red meat. And now I've made kind of a deal with myself that I don't buy meat. If somebody's gonna throw it out, I'm okay, well, I'll eat it. I want it more than the garbage wants it. But I don't want to be supporting, especially factory farms. But that said, I am in a really privileged position to be able to afford vegan alternatives. I often have time to cook. I have time to go grocery shopping. I like cooking. I have time to plan out meals. And that's something that, not a lot of working class people maybe have. If you're working 2 jobs to cover rent, you definitely don't have time to, do all your meal prep for the week and cook delicious vegan meals that are also nutritious and satisfy your basic nutritional requirements. So we can't emphasize personal choices. My strategy going forward is, emphasize reduction. Portion sizes of meat are way too big, and the reason why they're that big is because the capitalist class makes a lot of money off of selling us meat, and so they have invested in selling us more meat, like everything else. But reduce as much as you can and push for political solutions that make vegan food or vegetarian food cheaper to both buy and cheaper to produce than animal agriculture. And what that looks like is really heavy restrictions on animal agriculture, really heavy fines for pollution and agricultural emissions. That'll generally help to phase it out even within the capitalist structure. I don't see a whole lot of future for large meat portions past this decade, to be honest. And then the last question that I wrote down was, is it bad to produce food faster? Essentially, from the veterinarian talking about chicken production. And I want to say no, but there's a few questions that you do definitely have to ask. And is it nutritious still if it's being produced twice as fast? Is it fewer emissions if it's being produced twice as fast? Are the animals being tortured? And who benefits? So is the consumer benefiting? Is it cheaper, and is that a good thing? Or is it overwhelmingly benefiting the capitalist class to have chickens be produced that are less nutritious or whatever? I'm not sure about the science, but we really do need to ask these scrutinous questions and take it on a case-by-case basis, because not everything being produced faster is a bad thing, and not everything being produced faster benefits the consumer.
Okay, now you can go, Gary.
Finally.
I want to bring us back to action. One of the things I think that socialists have to do is connect more to the movement. I mean, Ian mentioned this with XR, yeah, Extinction Rebellion. Whether or not we agree with whoever's leading it, if they're leading people, we want to tell them about socialism. We want to tell them about the causes of, where the cause is, and help raise demands that are democratic and transitional demands, things like, some right over your own food choices, and some, stopping oil and fossil fuel production and blocking things. Basically, we want to support any movement that blocks any progress at all of fossil fuels, and we want to start raising the idea of taking it over and eliminating it, taking it over and shutting it down. So we have to we're very good at paying attention to what's going on in the labor movement and the NDP and anti-war movements and support for and anti-imperialist struggles, and we have to be that good, and I don't think we've reached that stage in socialist action where we're as attentive or go out of our way to make connections to the anti-climate change movement, and we have to be. We have to make those connections. That's where we're going to meet the people that realize that their future is in danger. And by the way, you're going to meet a lot of women leaders, and you're going to meet a lot of young leaders, and that's good. So just a note to self here is really what I'm talking about us socialists. And whether you're a member of Socialist Action or not, if you're a socialist of any stripe, shade, red has got to be more green. So we have to get out there and hustle in the green movement.